My name is Daniel, and I have driven the same stretch of county road for nearly 8 years. I work night shifts at a manufacturing plant on the edge of town, and my commute takes me through a quiet, rural stretch surrounded by woods and old farmland. Most nights are uneventful, just the occasional deer crossing or the dim glow of another driver far ahead. But one night last October, during a relentless rainstorm, something happened that I still can't explain. The rain had started in the late afternoon, light at first, but by the time my shift ended at midnight, it was coming down in sheets. The plant's parking lot glistened under the yellow security lights, and the air carried that heavy, metallic scent that comes before flooding. I pulled my hood up, hurried to my car, and slid inside, shaking the rain from my jacket. My windshield wipers squealed as they swiped away water that instantly replaced itself. Driving in heavy rain doesn't usually scare me, but that night felt different. The darkness seemed thicker, as though the storm had pulled it closer to the ground. Even with my high beams on, I could only see about 30 feet ahead. Every now and then, a flash of lightning would rip the sky open, revealing the black silhouettes of trees and the glistening asphalt stretching endlessly forward. Halfway through my drive, the road narrowed and passed over a small bridge. Usually, there's a shallow creek underneath, but when I approached it that night, I saw that the water had risen, spilling over the edges. My headlights caught the swirling, debris-filled current rushing past. I slowed to a crawl. That's when I saw him. A man stood on the other side of the bridge, half in the road, wearing a dark coat and what looked like a brimmed hat. The rain poured over him, but he didn't move. He didn't wave me down, didn't step aside. He just stood there, facing my car as if waiting for me. Something about the way he was positioned made my stomach twist. He was completely still, even in the wind, like he wasn't really part of the storm at all. I flicked my high beams off and on, hoping maybe he was in trouble and needed help. No reaction. My first thought was that he might be a stranded motorist, but I didn't see any vehicle nearby. My second thought was that I should turn around, but the road behind me was long and winding, and the idea of reversing into that darkness wasn't appealing. Against my better judgment, I inched forward. As I got closer, my headlights lit him more clearly. His coat looked old, the fabric worn and heavy, and his hat shadowed most of his face. The only detail I could make out was his mouth slightly open, as if he were whispering something I couldn't hear. I rolled my window down halfway, rain blowing in. "You okay?" I called out. His head tilted slightly to the side. That's when I noticed the water around his boots. The bridge was flooding faster than I thought, and he was standing ankle-deep, completely unbothered. "You shouldn't be out here," I said, raising my voice over the storm. Then he spoke. So quietly I almost didn't catch it. "It's not safe ahead." The way he said it didn't sound like a warning from a concerned person. It was flat, almost rehearsed, like he was repeating something he'd been told a long time ago. I hesitated. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. His mouth just kept moving, repeating the phrase again and again. "It's not safe ahead," but his eyes, now barely visible under the brim, were fixed directly on mine. Something in me snapped into panic mode. I put the car in reverse, planning to back up enough to turn around. But as my tires rolled back, a flash of lightning lit the bridge, and he was gone. I slammed the brakes. The spot where he'd been standing was empty. No footprints, no splashing water where he might have stepped away. Just the rushing current and the pounding rain. I sat there, gripping the wheel so hard, my knuckles ached. My breathing was loud in the cabin. I knew I hadn't imagined him, the detail of his clothes, the sound of his voice, it was all too vivid. But where could he have gone in less than a second? I decided I wasn't going to find out. I turned the car around and took the long way home through back roads I barely remembered. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my hands were trembling. The next morning, I awoke to news reports of a fatal accident on that same stretch of road less than half a mile past the bridge. A pickup truck had lost control in the floodwater, sliding into a ditch where the water was deep enough to submerge it. The driver had drowned. The time of the accident, just after midnight. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, that maybe the man had been a real person who'd just left before the lightning struck. But in my gut, I knew. He wasn't warning me about the storm. He was warning me about something else, and whatever it was, I'm glad I didn't stick around to see it. It was the kind of rain that didn't just fall, it poured in sheets, turning everything outside into a blurry watercolor painting. I was driving home from my sister's place that night, a late visit that had stretched far longer than I'd intended. By the time I finally left, it was well past midnight. The streets were nearly empty, the kind of empty that makes you aware of every sound your car makes, from the squeak of the windshield wipers to the hum of the tires on wet pavement. About 20 miles from home, my gas light flicked on. I cursed under my breath, knowing I'd been pushing my luck for the last 30 minutes. There was a small gas station just off the highway, one of those old ones with flickering fluorescent lights and only 2 pumps. I'd passed it plenty of times before, but I'd never stopped there at night. The rain came down even harder as I pulled in, the station's overhang offering little protection from the wind-driven spray. The place was lit by 2 buzzing lights, one of which blinked irregularly, creating moments of shadow that made the lot feel darker than it should have been. The small convenience store attached to the station was closed, its windows dark, but the pumps were still working. I stepped out, pulling my hood over my head, and started fueling up. That's when I noticed him. He was standing just beyond the edge of the overhang, about 20 feet away, his shape barely visible through the rain. At first I thought he was just another traveler waiting for a ride, maybe smoking under the shelter of a nearby sign. But the longer I looked, the less sense it made. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even shifting his weight like people usually do when they're standing in the cold. He just stood there, facing me directly. Something about that stillness set off a quiet alarm in the back of my mind. I told myself to ignore it. People wait for rides in bad weather all the time. I kept my eyes on the pump, watching the numbers climb, pretending I didn't feel the weight of his gaze. But when I glanced up again, he had moved closer. Not by much, but enough for me to notice. Maybe 15 feet now. And still, he just stood there, head tilted slightly as though trying to study my face through the rain. I felt my pulse quicken. I looked around the lot, half expecting to see another car pull in or someone step out from behind the station, but it was just us. The man, me, and the rain. When the pump clicked off, I shoved the nozzle back into its slot and climbed into my car, locking the doors immediately. My hands were damp, partly from the rain, partly from the sweat gathering at my palms. I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was walking toward me now. Slow steps, deliberate, not hurrying, not stopping, just coming closer. I threw the car into Dr. and pulled out faster than I probably should have on the slick pavement. My headlights swept across him for just a second as I passed. That's when I saw his face, or rather, the absence of it. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and there were no eyebrows, no hair at all, and no expression. His eyes, if you could call them that, were black. Not dark brown, not shadowed, but black. The kind of black that reflects no light. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back again until I was safely on the highway, heart still racing, every instinct screaming at me to put as much distance between myself and that gas station as possible. But even as the miles stretched between us, a thought burrowed into my mind and refused to leave. The store had been closed. The lot had been empty. No cars had been parked nearby. So what was he waiting for in the rain? And how did he get there in the first place? It was the kind of rain that made you feel like the world was shrinking. Sheets of water fell so heavily that even with my wipers on full speed, I could barely see 10 feet ahead. My car's headlights caught nothing but endless droplets, each one a glistening streak in the night. I had been driving for almost 4 hours, trying to get home after visiting my parents in a small rural town. The storm had rolled in much earlier than forecasted, and now every mile of the road felt like a gamble. Around 11:30 p.m., I came to a stretch of highway I'd never liked. It ran low through a wooded valley where water often pooled after heavy rain. I slowed down, knowing that flash floods could form here. My phone's signal had died about 20 minutes earlier, so GPS was no help. I was relying on memory and whatever road signs the storm hadn't swallowed in darkness. Up ahead, my headlights caught something strange. At first I thought it was a downed tree or debris in the road. As I got closer, I realized it was a man. He was standing on the shoulder, completely drenched, his head bowed, his arms hanging limply at his sides. The rain plastered his dark hair to his face. He wasn't waving for help or even looking at me, just standing there. My first thought was that he'd been in some kind of accident. I slowed to a crawl, trying to see if there was a wreck nearby. The water on the road was deep enough that every tire rotation sent ripples out into the blackness. On either side, the man still didn't move. I rolled my window down slightly, the storm instantly pushing icy water against my arm. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice nearly swallowed by the pounding rain. No answer. I tried again, a little louder. "Do you need help?" Slowly, his head tilted upward, and that's when I saw his eyes. They reflected the light strangely, as if they weren't catching it in a normal way. It wasn't the flat shine of an animal's eyes in headlights, but something more uneven. I couldn't tell their color, only that they seemed too dark and too wide for his pale, water-slicked face. Something about him made me hesitate. My instincts were screaming that stopping completely was a bad idea. I shifted into a lower gear and inched forward, meaning to pass him and get out of this stretch before the water rose any higher. As my car edged closer, the man suddenly stepped forward, not toward my side of the car, but directly into the lane ahead of me. I slammed on the brakes. The tires skidded on the wet asphalt, and for a second I thought I was going to hit him. My headlights lit his soaked clothing, an old button-up shirt clinging to his skin, trousers that looked decades out of date. He stood there, unmoving, as if the cold water soaking him didn't bother him at all. My pulse pounded in my ears. "Get out of the road," I yelled, but the words felt pointless. He didn't react. The rain was so heavy that I could barely see past him now, just the distorted outlines of trees. I considered getting out, but something deep in my gut told me not to. Instead, I flicked my high beams on, hoping to startle him. The moment the light hit his face again, I saw his mouth twitch upward in the smallest, most unsettling smile I've ever witnessed. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked off the road into the flooded ditch beside it. He didn't stumble, didn't splash, didn't even seem slowed by the knee-high water. The darkness swallowed him almost instantly. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. Was he in shock? Lost? Or had I just encountered someone who wanted to lure me out of my car in the middle of a storm? A flash of lightning lit the valley. In that split second of white light, I saw him again, standing halfway up the embankment. Turned toward me, watching. My chest tightened. I floored the gas, the car jerking forward through the rising water. The rain intensified, hammering the roof like hundreds of tiny fists. I kept my eyes on the slick ribbon of road ahead, forcing myself not to look in the mirrors. The image of his pale, smiling face burned in my mind, and I knew that if I saw him standing behind me, I might lose control of the car entirely. After what felt like an eternity, the road began to rise, pulling me out of the valley. My phone's signal returned, but I didn't dare stop until I reached the first gas station I could find. Its flickering fluorescent lights a welcome sight. Inside, I told the clerk there was a man stranded by the flooded road. He frowned and said that stretch had been closed for almost 2 years because of a washout that had never been repaired. The barricades often got knocked over during storms, but no one should have been down there, not on foot, and certainly not without being swept away. I drove home that night, but every time I think about that flooded valley, I remember his eyes first, and his smile second, and I have never taken that road again. Asterisk. I had just moved into the quiet little neighborhood on the outskirts of town when the knocking began. The first night, it was faint. So faint, I thought it might have been the wind rattling something loose on my porch. But then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks on my front door. I hesitated. It was nearly midnight, and I didn't know a soul here yet. Looking through the peephole, I saw nothing. Just the empty porch bathed in the yellow glow of the single street lamp across the road. No movement, no shadows. I opened the door a crack, expecting to see a stray animal or maybe a prankster. But there was no one. The second night, the knocks came earlier, around 11:45. 3 measured taps. I looked outside before even opening the door this time, but again, nothing. The air was still, the street quiet. I shut the door and told myself it was just some kid trying to mess with the new neighbor. By the third night, I was uneasy enough to leave my phone recording. At exactly midnight, the knocks came again. This time, I didn't move from the couch. The knocks were slower, heavier, as if whoever it was wanted me to feel their presence. I sat frozen, staring at the door. After a moment, the sound stopped. The next morning, I checked the recording. The knocks were there, loud and clear, but layered beneath them was something else. A woman's voice, low whispering words I couldn't make out. I played it again, turning up the volume. This time I could hear the faintest trace of syllables. Let me in. My stomach tightened. I knew I hadn't imagined it. I even checked my locks twice before leaving for work that day. The following night, I decided to confront whoever it was. Midnight came, and so did the knocks. 3 slow thuds. I swung the door open. There she was. A woman in her late 20s, dressed in a faded blue dress that looked decades out of place. Her hair was long, black, and damp as though she'd just stepped out of the rain. Her skin was pale, almost gray in the porch light, and her eyes were completely black, like polished stones. She smiled, revealing teeth that looked far too sharp. You left the door locked, she said softly. I slammed the door before she could take a step forward. My hands shook so badly I could barely lock it again. She knocked again, but now it was faster, harder. The wood rattled. Let me in, she said, her voice no longer soft but demanding. It's cold out here. I backed away into the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife I could find. The knocking stopped, but I didn't move until the first light of morning came through my blinds. I didn't sleep at all that night. I told my neighbor about it the next day, hoping maybe she'd have seen the woman before. Her face went pale. She told me about a girl who had lived in my house years ago. She had vanished one night after answering a knock at the door around midnight. The police never found her. The only clue was that her front door had been left wide open. That night, I packed a bag and drove to a motel on the other side of town. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just wanted to feel safe for one night. But when midnight came, I woke up in the motel room to 3 slow knocks. On the door. It was one of those late autumn nights when the rain doesn't just fall. It hangs in the air like a fine mist, coating everything in a cold, slick sheen. My wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear, smearing more than wiping, and my headlights cut through the darkness in pale, trembling beams. I was driving home from a work conference in another city, 3 hours from where I lived, and the road I'd taken was the kind of narrow 2-lane highway that seemed almost abandoned after sundown. It had been raining steadily for hours. The occasional gust of wind pushed the water across the pavement in shimmering sheets. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, leaning forward a little, not out of nervousness but to focus better through the water-speckled glass. I kept telling myself that the quicker I got home, the sooner I could crawl into bed, away from the cold, damp world outside. About 40 minutes into the drive, the GPS showed nothing but a long stretch of road. No towns, no gas stations, no signs of life for miles. It was a rural area, surrounded by dense, skeletal trees that swayed slightly in the wind. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thud of the wipers. That's when I saw him at first. I thought it was just a shadow, something thrown oddly across the wet asphalt. But as I got closer, I realized there was a figure standing directly in the middle of my lane. A man, motionless. Tall, wearing what looked like a long coat that clung to his body from the rain. His head was tilted slightly downward, face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. I eased my foot onto the brake, my heartbeat instantly louder than the rain. The car slowed, and I flicked my high beams on. The light washed over him, revealing that the coat wasn't a coat at all. It looked more like an old, heavy robe, the kind of fabric that would soak through almost immediately in this weather. His arms hung loosely at his sides. He didn't move. The road was too narrow to swerve without risking going into the ditch, and I had no intention of stopping completely. I slowed to a crawl, horn blaring once in warning, hoping he would just step aside. He didn't single quotes T. Instead. As I crept closer, he raised his head slightly, enough for the light to catch the bottom half of his face. His skin was pale, the kind of pallor you only see on someone who hasn't been outside in the sun for years. His lips were thin, colorless, and stretched into the faintest smile. Something about that smile made my stomach tighten. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't threatening in the normal sense either. It was the expression of someone who was already certain of something you didn't know yet. I jerked the wheel just enough to get around him, my right tires skimming the edge of the wet shoulder. As I passed, I kept my eyes on him. He didn't turn to watch me go. He just stayed there, smiling faintly at nothing, as if the rain and the dark belonged to him. I accelerated, glancing at my rearview mirror. He was still there, getting smaller, but the image stuck in my mind. That strange stillness, that robe, that smile. 5 minutes later, I was starting to convince myself it was nothing more than a weird roadside encounter. Maybe he was a lost hiker or a farmer whose car had broken down. Maybe he was drunk. My nerves began to settle, but then I saw him again, up ahead. In the middle of the lane, I slammed the brakes harder this time, my tires hissing against the wet pavement. It was the same man, same robe clinging to him, same hat dripping with water, same tilted head and faint, unnerving smile. It was impossible. There had been no side roads, no driveways, nowhere for him to cut through the dense woods fast enough to appear ahead of me. I stared for a moment, my breath fogging the glass, before I slowly started moving forward again, deciding to pass him, just like before. This time, though, as I pulled alongside him, he moved, his head turned sharply toward me, and I saw his eyes. They were open too wide, unblinking, with irises so pale they seemed almost white under the glare of my headlights. His mouth opened slightly, just enough for me to see that his teeth were small and uniform, but there were far too many of them. Not jagged, not monstrous, just wrong in number. I pushed the accelerator, the car lurching forward. The urge to check the mirror fought with the certainty that I didn't want to see him again, but I couldn't help it. I glanced back. He was gone. The spot where he had stood was empty. The road shimmered wetly under the headlights, but there was no sign of him. I tried to convince myself that maybe the rain and darkness were playing tricks on me. Maybe there had been two different people, and my mind just blurred them together. That was easier to believe than the alternative. I drove faster after that, my eyes scanning every bend in the road. About 10 minutes passed before I saw lights. Ahead, dim yellow ones, the kind that hung over old rural gas stations. Relieved, I pulled in. The place looked like it hadn't changed since the 70s, with a single pump under a rusted metal awning and a small convenience store glowing weakly in the rain. Inside, the store smelled faintly of oil and coffee. A middle-aged man in a flannel shirt stood behind the counter, flipping through a newspaper. He looked up when I entered, giving me a polite nod. "Cold night to be driving," he said. I nodded, too out of sorts to make small talk. Still, I had to ask, "Hey, have you ever seen someone standing out on the road?" Tall guy, wearing a robe and a wide hat. The man froze for half a second, just a fraction of a pause before he set the paper down. "Where?" he asked. "About 10 miles back," I said. "Middle of the road." I passed him twice. Or, I think I did. His eyes narrowed slightly. Then he glanced at the clock on the wall. Without another word, he reached under the counter and pulled out a small flashlight. "The kind you might keep ready in case the power went out. You should keep driving," he said. "Don't stop until you hit the main highway. You're about 25 miles from it. Don't pull over for anything." Something in his tone made me take him seriously. I nodded, thanked him, and headed back into the rain. As I pulled away, I caught him watching me through the window, his face unreadable. The next stretch of road was even darker, winding deeper into the woods. The rain had eased into a light drizzle, but the fog began to roll in, curling over the pavement in low white tendrils. My high beams caught every droplet, turning the air into a glowing haze. And then I saw him again. He was closer this time, not in the road, but standing just off the shoulder, half hidden in the fog. He was facing me directly, head tilted back slightly, mouth open, as if tasting the damp night air. His robe clung to him, darker now, almost black from the wetness. I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew they were open. Watching my pulse thundered. As I sped past, I didn't dare look back. My grip on the wheel was so tight, my hands ached. The only thing I wanted was to reach the highway and be done with this drive forever. When I finally saw the green reflective sign for the interstate, I nearly laughed out loud in relief. I turned onto the on-ramp, the bright white lights of passing traffic ahead like a promise. The world felt normal again, full of other cars and the steady hum of civilization. I didn't see him again, but the image of him, the pale eyes, the wrong smile, the robe soaking in the rain never left me. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the rain is steady, I find myself glancing at the road outside my house. Part of me expects to see him there, standing perfectly still, just waiting. Asterisk, it had been raining since late afternoon. The kind of rain that seemed to hang in the air rather than fall, coating everything in a cold, damp mist. I was driving home from my late shift at the diner, the windshield wipers squeaking rhythmically across the glass as they fought against the stubborn drizzle. It was just past midnight, and the road through the industrial district was mostly deserted. Streetlights were few and far between, leaving long stretches of road in near darkness. The sound of the rain on my roof was oddly hypnotic, and for a while, I almost forgot I was even driving. That is, until I saw her. She was standing at the bus stop on the corner of Maple and Fifth. There was no shelter there, just a rusted metal sign and a bench slick with water. The woman stood under the sign, completely still, wearing a pale dress that clung to her in the rain. Her hair was long and dark, plastered to her face. At first I thought she must be freezing, but she didn't seem to shiver or even move. I slowed my car as I passed her. She didn't glance at me, didn't adjust her stance, didn't even wipe the wet hair from her face. She just stared straight ahead at the empty street, as if waiting for a bus that wasn't coming. Something about it made the hair on my arm stand up. I told myself she was just a stranded passenger. Maybe she'd missed the last bus and was waiting for a ride. But this was the industrial district. No one took the bus here after 10 p.m., especially not in this weather. I drove past trying to push the image out of my head. A mile later I glanced in my rearview mirror, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a shape moving along the side of the road. I blinked and it was gone, hidden in the sheets of rain. About 10 minutes later, I came to another bus stop near the edge of town, and that's when my stomach dropped. She was there, the same woman, same soaked pale dress, same hair hanging in her face, standing under another rusted sign in the rain. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. That was impossible. There was no way. She could have gotten here before me, unless she'd been driven. But I had been the only car on the road. I passed her again, this time not slowing down. My pulse was thudding in my ears, and the sound of the rain had grown almost deafening. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe it was just someone who looked like her, but a cold dread kept growing in my chest. Another few miles, and I reached the outskirts of the residential area where I lived. There was one last bus stop before the neighborhood. She was there. This time, she was facing me. The rain plastered her dress to her skin, and I could see her bare feet on the wet pavement. Her head was tilted slightly downward, but I could still make out her eyes, dark, unblinking, fixed right on me as my headlights washed over her. My foot hesitated over the gas, and for a split second, I considered stopping to ask if she needed help. But then, I saw her mouth move. She whispered something, her lips forming the words slowly, deliberately. I couldn't hear her through the rain and the hum of the engine, but it looked like she was mouthing the word stop. I didn't stop. Drove home as quickly as I could, my heart pounding harder with every turn. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I felt like I'd been holding my breath for the last half hour. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me and telling myself I was safe. The rain was still coming down outside, tapping steadily against the windows. I changed into dry clothes and tried to shake it off. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard it, a light tapping at the front door. It was barely audible over the rain at first, just a faint, irregular sound. But it grew more deliberate, like the sound of knuckles rapping gently on wood. I froze in the middle of the living room. The tapping stopped. Then came 3 slow, heavy knocks. I crept to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek out into the darkness. She was standing in my driveway. Her hair hung limply over her face, but I could still see those dark eyes staring right at the window. She wasn't shivering, even though the rain was still pouring down. She just stood there, waiting. I backed away from the window and grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, and I told them there was a strange woman outside my house, that she'd been following me. While I was speaking, I heard movement on the porch. Not footsteps exactly, more like the slow dragging of something across the wooden boards. Then silence. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. They searched the yard, the street, even the surrounding houses, but they found nothing. Not a single wet footprint on the porch. They told me it was probably just someone who needed shelter from the rain, that she must have wandered off when she realized I'd called the police. But I know what I saw. In the next night, when the rain returned, I couldn't bring myself to take that road home again, because I'm certain that if I had stopped at any of those bus stops, I wouldn't have made it home at all. I had been on the road for almost 12 hours when I finally gave in to exhaustion. My original plan was to make it straight to my brother's place in Oklahoma by nightfall, but between the rain, the traffic, and my own stubborn tendency to avoid stopping for breaks, The day had stretched longer than expected. The storm had swallowed the sun hours ago. The rain didn't fall in sheets, it fell in curtains, heavy and relentless, making the highway look like an endless dark ribbon beneath a moving wall of water. I spotted the motel's sign through the blur of my wipers, a flickering red and blue neon rectangle that read Pine Hollow Motor Inn. It was one of those roadside places that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. The kind where the office lights glow in unsettling orange and a single soda machine hums outside under a warped awning. But I didn't care. I needed a bed, even if it smelled faintly of mildew. Inside the small lobby, the man at the desk barely looked up from the newspaper in front of him. His hair was thin and gray, his glasses perched halfway down his nose. When he did meet my eyes, it was brief, as if acknowledging me was a minor inconvenience. I gave him my ID, paid in cash, and he slid a brass key across the counter with the number 12 engraved into the metal tag. "Checkout's at 10, he said, voice flat. I thanked him and headed back out into the rain. The motel had one long row of rooms, each with its own green-painted door and small square window. The parking lot was half full, but I didn't see a single person outside. I pulled into the space in front of room 12, grabbed my duffel, and let myself in. The room was exactly what I expected. Faded carpet, a bed with a floral comforter, a dresser with a bulky TV on top, and the faint odor of cigarette smoke that clung to the curtains. I set my bag down, turned on the heat, and sat on the bed. The springs groaned under my weight. The first phone call came about 20 minutes later. The room phone, sitting on the nightstand beside the bed, rang with a sharp, mechanical tone that made me jump. I stared at it for a moment before picking it up. "Hello?" There was no voice on the other end, only a faint, static-laced breathing. At first I thought it might be the front desk checking in, but no one spoke. "Is someone there?" I asked. Breathing grew slightly louder, then the line went dead. I hung up, chalking it up to a wrong number, and lay back on the bed. My body was sore from driving, my eyes gritty from lack of sleep. I thought about ignoring the next call if it happened, but I didn't expect it would. It happened again 20 minutes later, same ring, same pause when I answered, same faint breathing. This time, however, I heard something else, a soft scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across a rough surface. "Who is this?" I demanded. No answer, just breathing and that scraping noise, followed by a click. The storm outside deepened, wind rattling the window. I pulled the curtains tighter, telling myself it was just some bored kid dialing random rooms. But a part of me, the part that had felt a prickling unease since walking into the lobby, started to wonder if the call was meant for me. I tried to distract myself by flipping on the TV, but the channels were limited to fuzzy local news and reruns. I left it on for background noise while I unpacked a few things from my bag. The third call came at 11:13 p.m. By now, my pulse was already racing before I even picked up. "Hello?" The breathing was heavier this time, and then, finally, a voice. "You're in my room?" It was a man's voice, low and strained, as though each word scraped out from somewhere deep in his throat. "What?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is my room," he said again. "You shouldn't be here." I froze. My mind flicked back to the desk clerk, handing me the key without so much as glancing at a computer. "I think you've got the wrong number," I said, my voice sharper now. "I checked in tonight. This is room 12. The line went quiet. I thought he'd hung up, but then he whispered something I could barely make out. "Don't look out the window." The line went dead. Every nerve in my body lit up. My first instinct was to pull back the curtain and see if anyone was outside. But his words played over and over in my mind. The warning didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a plea. I sat back on the bed, staring at the phone, my heart pounding in my ears. Outside, the rain softened for the first time in hours, the storm shifting into a quieter, more uneasy rhythm. I could hear the distant hum of a truck on the highway. I told myself I wasn't going to answer if it rang again. But when it did, at exactly midnight, I found my hand moving toward it before I could stop myself. This time, there was no breathing, no voice. Only the sound of my own reflection, faint and strange, like I was speaking into a cave when I said, "Hello." And then I heard the click of the motel room door unlocking. The knob didn't turn, but the sound was unmistakable, the mechanical snap of the lock being disengaged. I dropped the phone, grabbed the small folding knife I kept in my bag, and backed toward the bathroom. I couldn't hear footsteps outside. The door didn't open. The phone began ringing again. I didn't answer. It kept ringing for what felt like minutes, then stopped. Silence pressed in from all sides. I inched toward the door, listening. That was when I noticed the brass key on the nightstand. The tag no longer said 12. It said 11. The next morning felt wrong before I had even opened my eyes. My phone was dead despite being on the charger all night, and the air in the room felt thicker, as though it were holding its breath with me. I got dressed and left without eating breakfast, almost desperate to get out of the apartment. The walk to work was quiet. Too quiet. Normally I would pass at least 2 or 3 people on my street at that hour: dog walkers, joggers, a man who always swept the sidewalk in front of his convenience store. But that day, the sidewalks were empty, and the store's metal shutter was still down. When I arrived at work, my coworker Brianna stared at me in a way that made me stop mid. She put down her coffee and said, "You look awful. Did you even sleep?" I told her I hadn't slept much. I didn't want to explain the figure in the mirror or the sudden shift in my apartment's atmosphere. She would have written it off as stress. Maybe she would have been right. But deep down I knew this wasn't stress. Around lunch, I checked my phone after plugging it in at my desk. Notifications had piled up, text messages from an unknown number. Every one of them contained a single word. Look, they were timestamped throughout the night, hours apart, like whoever sent them was watching me sleep and waiting for me to wake up. My stomach tightened. I deleted them without replying, hoping that would be the end of it. But something about the repetition of that one word stuck with me all day, like an itch in the back of my skull. That night, I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows. I pulled the blinds shut and covered the bathroom mirror with an old bedsheet. The weight of that sheet felt strangely comforting. Even though I knew it wouldn't stop anything, sleep came in short bursts, and every time I woke up, I felt the same oppressive awareness in the room, as if someone was standing just out of sight, leaning close enough to hear me breathe. Once, I thought I heard the faint scrape of fingernails against glass, but when I got up and checked the windows, there was nothing there. The following evening, I was brushing my teeth when the sheet over the mirror shifted, not fell shift, like something underneath had pressed against it from the other side. I froze, foam collecting in my mouth, and stared at the faint bulge forming in the fabric. It pulsed once, then flattened. I backed out of the bathroom slowly, keeping my eyes on the mirror. I didn't even bother rinsing my mouth. I just closed the door and sat in the living room with all the lights on until sunrise. Over the next few days, the mirror began to feel like a presence rather than an object. No matter where I was in the apartment, I felt it watching. I kept the door closed, but I started hearing noises from inside, soft knocking, faint shuffling, and, once, what sounded like someone whispering my name. Brianna noticed I was getting worse. She suggested I crash at her place for a night or two. I almost said yes, but the idea of leaving the apartment felt dangerous in a different way. What if the thing in the mirror decided to follow me? What if it was waiting for me to run? On Friday night, the knocking became constant, not frantic, steady, like a slow, deliberate code. I tried playing music to drown it out, but the sound seemed to seep through every other noise, matching the rhythm of my own heartbeat. At around 2 in the morning, the sheet fell. I don't know how I hadn't gone near it. I only realized when the bathroom door creaked open on its own, and I saw the pale rectangle of uncovered glass inside. I should have left right then, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped toward the bathroom, drawn in by something I can't explain. The mirror's surface was darker than it should have been, like it was reflecting a room with no light. My own reflection was faint, barely there, as if I were standing much farther away than I actually was. Then I saw movement behind my reflection, something pale, impossibly thin, slipping into the edge of the frame. Its head was bent at an unnatural angle, and when it lifted it, I realized there was no face. I stumbled back, hitting the doorframe hard enough to bruise. The thing in the glass stepped forward, its faceless head tilted, as if studying me. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pressed it to the inside of the mirror. A cold pressure bloomed against my chest. My breath caught. I wasn't touching the mirror, but I could feel its hand through me. My vision blurred, and I thought I heard that same whisper again, closer this time, curling into my ear. I tore myself away and slammed the bathroom door shut, shoving a chair under the handle. The knocking started again, harder this time. Shaking the door in its frame, I sat on the couch until morning, staring at that door, knowing it was only a matter of time before whatever was in there found its way out. The only sound was the low hum of the building's air circulation, mixed with the occasional crack or pop from the old wooden beams hidden above the drop ceiling. My skin prickled. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the building settling. A common explanation I had heard dozens of times from coworkers. But the truth was, I didn't believe it. I had been working here long enough to know that some of the noises in this place didn't fit any normal pattern. Still, I kept moving forward, the thin beam of my flashlight cutting a narrow path through the dark. At the far end of the corridor, I reached the door to the stairwell. It was one of those heavy fire doors with a long narrow window set into it. My first instinct was to check through the glass before pushing it open. The dim emergency light inside cast everything in a sickly orange glow. The stairwell was empty. I pushed the door open and stepped in, the hollow echo of my boots bouncing off the concrete walls. Halfway up the first flight, I froze. There was movement above me. It wasn't the normal scuffle of a mouse or the creak of a shifting pipe. This was slow, measured footsteps. I tilted my head, trying to pinpoint the location. It sounded like they were just one floor up, pacing. A few steps, pause. A few more steps. The pause was always the same length, as if whoever it was waiting for me to climb closer. That every rational thought in my head told me to turn around and leave. Call it in. Let someone else deal with it. But there was a pull, something about the sound that made me feel like I had to see, like I wouldn't be able to sleep if I didn't. I moved up the stairs quietly, one hand gripping the cold metal rail. As I reached the next landing, the footsteps above stopped. I waited, holding my breath. The silence stretched so long that I started to think I had imagined it. Then, from directly above me, a single loud step slammed into the concrete. It was so forceful, it vibrated through the rail under my hand. I jolted back, heart pounding, and took a step down. But before I could decide whether to retreat, a voice came drifting down through the stairwell. It was soft, almost conversational, but I couldn't make out the words. They were spoken in a rhythm, not quite a whisper, but too quiet to be natural. I took another step up, straining to listen. The voice stopped. Then came a sound that turned my stomach. The slow, deliberate drag of something heavy being pulled across the floor above. It lasted several seconds before it abruptly ended. I backed away until I was on the landing again, my mind racing. Every instinct told me that whatever was above me wasn't going to end well if I confronted it. But then I remembered something. The floor above this one was supposed to be sealed off entirely. It was under renovation, and the door was locked from the outside. No one should have been there. I turned and ran down the stairs, 2 at a time, my boots clanging against the metal treads. When I reached the ground floor, I went straight to the security office and pulled up the camera feed for the stairwell. The top floor camera was dark, which made no sense. We had emergency lighting everywhere. As I stared at the blank screen, a shape began to form in the blackness. At first I thought it was just the camera adjusting to low light, but the shape sharpened a tall, thin figure standing just at the edge of the frame. It was facing the camera, its head tilted slowly to one side, and for a moment I thought I could make out the faint glint of teeth in the dark. The feed went dead asterisk the next morning. Sunlight poured through the blinds, casting thin, bright lines across the floor. It was almost surreal how normal everything looked. The desk was still there. The drawers were closed. The air smelled faintly of coffee from the cafe downstairs. For a moment, I convinced myself it had been a dream. The scratching, the whispers. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after too many sleepless nights. But then I noticed something that made my stomach knot. The desk had been moved. It wasn't obvious at first. Maybe only a few inches, but enough that the dust outline on the floor didn't match anymore. I ran my fingers along the wood, half expecting it to be warm, or damp, or different somehow. It wasn't. It was just a desk. Except now, I didn't want to touch it. I stepped back, watching it the way you might watch a sleeping animal you don't trust to stay asleep. When I went to work, the thought followed me. I kept thinking about how heavy that desk was. It would take effort to move it even an inch. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone had moved it. I thought about asking the landlord again, but I knew how it would sound. "Hi, the desk you insisted was just furniture is moving on its own. Can you do something about it?" No, that wasn't going to help. That night, I locked my door, then set my phone up on a chair, recording video of the desk while I slept. I woke up at 3:19 a.m., heart pounding. No noise, no scratching this time, just that sudden, unnatural awareness that something was wrong. The phone's screen was still lit, showing the live recording. The desk hadn't moved. I almost felt stupid for being afraid. Then the video flickered. It wasn't my phone glitching. The picture itself shifted, like the desk was suddenly closer to the camera. But I hadn't moved it, and the timestamp on the recording didn't jump. It was as if the desk had leaned toward the lens, just slightly, and then settled back. I stopped the recording and replayed it. At 2:46 a.m., the footage showed the desk as it had always been. At 2:47, the shadows deepened. Something, I couldn't tell what, seemed to stretch across the floor. Just for a moment, it wasn't human-shaped. It was more like the silhouette of someone crawling, but the proportions were wrong. I turned off the phone, shoved it under my pillow, and didn't sleep again. The next day, I pushed the desk into the hallway. I told myself I didn't care. If the landlord got mad, I couldn't stand having it inside anymore. When I came home from work, it was back, sitting exactly where it had been. The rain intensified, hammering the roof of the old church until the sound swallowed every other noise. I sat on the floor in front of the pulpit, my knees tucked against my chest, trying to convince myself that I was safe. The stranger was gone. I had watched him leave. But the longer I sat there, the more I became aware of the subtle shift in the atmosphere around me. It was as if the air itself was heavier, colder, and filled with the faint hum of something just beyond the range of human hearing. My breath fogged in front of my face. I turned my head toward the far corner of the nave, where the shadows seemed thicker. At first I thought it was just the uneven candlelight casting strange shapes. Then the shadows began to move, deliberately uncoiling from the darkness like smoke rising in reverse. I stood, backing away toward the side aisle. My foot caught on the edge of a warped floorboard, and the creak echoed through the space like a gunshot. The shadows froze, as though listening. Then they began to creep forward. I bolted, my footsteps pounding against the old wood. I headed for the small door at the side of the altar that led into the sacristy. The latch was cold under my fingers, but it stuck for a moment before finally giving way. The sacristy was pitch black, the only light seeping in from the open door behind me. The air smelled of mildew and something metallic, like rust or blood. I shut the door and braced my back against it, straining to hear anything beyond the sound of my own breathing. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a soft knock. Not at the door I had just closed, but behind me. I spun around, eyes straining in the darkness. There was another door at the far end of the sacristy, one I hadn't noticed before. The knocking came again, louder this time, followed by a slow, dragging scrape against the wood. I didn't move. My body wouldn't let me. The knocking stopped. In its place came a voice, low and calm, yet strangely hollow, as though it were being spoken through a long metal tube. You opened the wrong door. The words made my stomach twist. I didn't know what they meant, and I didn't want to. I turned and yanked the first door back open, fleeing into the nave. But it wasn't the nave anymore. The pews were gone, replaced by an endless corridor of narrow wooden walls stretching far into the distance. The flickering candlelight had been replaced by a cold white glow with no visible source. The air was silent, not quiet, but utterly absent of sound. The way a vacuum feels in your chest. I started walking, my footsteps somehow muted against the floor. I tried to turn back, but the door had vanished behind me. The corridor felt wrong. The angles seemed to bend slightly inward, like the walls were leaning toward each other just enough to make you claustrophobic. Every 50 feet or so, there was another door, each one identical, each one shut tight. I don't know how long I walked. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours. Time didn't feel right here. Eventually, I heard footsteps that weren't mine. They came from somewhere ahead, measured and slow, each one echoing faintly down the corridor. I froze, waiting, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder. Stop. It grew louder. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering. The footsteps drew closer until I could make out a figure in the distance. At first it looked like a man, but the proportions were slightly off to tall, with arms that hung just a little too low, its head tilted in sharp, unnatural angles as it walked. I wanted to run, but I knew instinctively that if I made a sound, it would hear me. So I stayed still. The figure passed one of the doors, and for a moment, its head snapped toward it. Without breaking stride, it reached out and touched the doorknob. The door swung open to reveal pure blackness. The figure stepped inside without hesitation, and the door closed behind it. When I finally moved again, I started walking faster, ignoring the burning in my legs. I didn't look back. I don't remember how I got out. My memory jumps one moment. I was in that corridor. The next I was lying on the floor of the church, rain still hammering the roof. My body shivering uncontrollably. The doors were all gone. When I staggered outside, the rain had stopped. The stranger from earlier was standing by the gate, his back to me. "You made it further than most," he said without turning around. I wanted to ask what he meant, but he started walking away before I could open my mouth. I haven't been back to that church since, but sometimes, at night, I hear knocking somewhere in my house. Always soft, always patient, and I'm terrified of what will happen if I ever open the wrong door again.